Will members kindly take their seats? Welcome to the Caucus of the Whole of the Vermont House on Friday, May 16th at 11:30. This is a Caucus of the Whole on S-127, an act relating to housing and housing development. This bill has had a journey through the House. It's been several committees have been working on it, from environment to commerce and economic development, housing in general, Ways and Means, and it is currently in House Appropriations. The Ways and Means Amendment is complex, and there's been some misinformation out there and a lot of questions, so I thought a Caucus of the Whole would be helpful to get a presentation and have an opportunity for members to ask questions. So with that, I'll turn it over to Representative Kimball.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. So I would like to thank the Speaker for giving me and our committee an opportunity to really go through S-127, the committee Ways and Means Amendment to the bill. This is a complex proposal with multiple places in the legislative language to cause confusion. And I have to keep remembering that I volunteered to do this. Kind of like in the Jason Bourne movie when they said, well, Jason, you volunteered. So the purpose of meeting with you today is very straightforward, to provide a straightforward explanation of the Ways and Means Committee amendment, what we intended to do in the amendment, to address some misconceptions about what the bill does and what it does not do, and to provide answers to the questions you may have. This is not a walkthrough of the bill. So I've got 10 minutes, I've got 10 points. First, S-127 is a housing bill. Ways and Means had possession because the proposed tax increment financing for housing is the responsibility and policy area of the committee. So our intent in amending the bill was to put reasonable guardrails around this tax increment program that affects the revenues of the state, and more specifically, the statewide education property tax and the education fund. Second, tax increment financing is by nature very complex. We did not add complexity to the administration of the program. We're looking in the future, not in this bill, but realizing that we need to provide assistance to municipalities to administer those programs where they have an interest in advancing community and housing infrastructure programs. Third, the bill does not cancel the existing statewide TIF program, tax increment financing program. That has been a critical tool for economic development and revitalization across the state. Communities like St. Albans, Winooski, South Burlington, Hartford, Milton, the Burlington waterfront can all point to success of using TIFs in their communities. Barrie continues to work on developing their district. Killington is getting up and running. Rutland is just approved. That work is not easy. It is not instant. It is not risk-free. But when it works well. Fourth, the community and housing infrastructure program that was proposed in the bill is actually a more streamlined, less bureaucratic version than the statewide TIF. I know it's hard to believe, but it is. Fifth, rulemaking is necessary as a part of the process in any program like CHIP. We've asked VEPSI to address rulemaking in order to prioritize the approval of projects according to meeting the intent of the bill, to encourage the development of low and moderate income housing, bringing regional equity to address blight and addressing the real housing needs in our regions. We thought that it would be important to make sure that this was distributed across the state and not just in different pockets. Sixth, the scale of investment that could result from CHIP is huge. We know that with recent results or recent reports from the Department of Housing that we're about 41,000 short on what is needed in housing development over the next 5 years. That is an overwhelming number. We have 330,000 housing units today, so it's a huge increase. In the past couple of years, it's been about 2,400 new housing starts. So we're far off the goal if we have to develop 7,000 to 8,000 housing units per year. CHIP, the Community Housing and Infrastructure Program, could result in supporting the infrastructure needed to support new housing, anywhere from 2,000 to 7,000 new housing units. That is a meaningful contribution to the needs of housing in the state. It is not the only tool, but it's a very important tool. We have to remember that back in 1988, that was the peak of new housing construction of 4,800 units. And since then, it's been much lower, hitting, I think, 1,500 is the low point. CHIP is not the only tool. Community Housing and Infrastructure Program is not the only tool. Remember that this is geared for infrastructure. The rest of the housing development has to be financed in a different way. So that could be builders that are going out and finding loans or finding equity or finding other grant programs to contribute to the construction of housing. CHIP is really dedicated towards that infrastructure. Now I'm going to talk about the really confusing part, and that's the cap. That might be number 7, I'm not sure. So the cap that we have in the bill is for $40 million in commitments in any one year from the Vermont Economic Progress Council, and that is $40 million in the lifetime incremental retention. That's very confusing. But what we are attempting to do is limit the exposure to the education fund or the statewide education tax of 1 penny on the grant list. So then in any one year, we weren't going to have foregone revenue to the education fund of more than a penny, $14 million, rounding up. In order to get to that, we'd have to work backwards as to what does that equate to in annual commitments that would be administered by the Vermont Economic Progress Council. And working backwards, with the help of the Joint Fiscal Office, that is $40 million in commitments for that cohort of projects per year. Now, this means that VEPC could approve $40 million of projects every year that the program exists, not just that one year. Let's go backwards one more step. Well, what does that mean, $40 million in increment financing? If you do the math, and it depends on who you ask, it'll equate to either $145 million or $240 million, depending if you account for a 5% increase in property tax rates. So that's huge. We're talking about that amount of private investment together with the amount of infrastructure investment that will service that amount of debt taken out for the necessary infrastructure. Number 7-ish. Where could these developments occur? Ways and Means did take a look at simplifying what we receive from House General and Housing. So confusing in there is the part about when does Tier 1A and Tier 1B start and what is Tier 2 and where is it? It's really anything not Tier 1 or Tier 3. So what we tried to do is reference what was enacted last year in Act 181 of those areas that are exempt from Act 250 on a temporary basis until July 1st, 2027. Second, we looked at settlement areas. And settlement areas is a fairly expansive term. It includes village centers, designated downtowns, neighborhood development areas, growth centers, new town centers. There's 248 of those communities in the state, 248. And it also includes any compact settled areas. So it could be a group of houses that don't have that designation, that are eligible to have CHIP financing. So we didn't think it was smaller, we thought it was more expansive. 9, who is this for? Who is benefiting from CHIP? When we looked at the bill, it came to us as focused really on low and moderate income households. What we heard is that we need housing of every type, not just low and moderate income. So we looked at expanding what that definition is by looking at expanding it up to middle income. As it is presented in the bill right now, that is 150% of area median income, and that varies by county. So it's really including low income, moderate income, and middle income. It's not just exclusively any of those two. So we need all housing. Number 10 is the education fund. So we made this a shorter program than was originally proposed to us. It was proposed as a 10-year program. We shortened it to 5 from the time that rulemaking was finished. The reason we did that is this is a brand new program that is a potential liability on the statewide education fund and the statewide education property tax. So we wanted to have the opportunity to review it. So that's why we set a sunset for 5 years from now. We've got a lot going on in terms of what's going to affect our statewide education property tax. Remember that we did use $77 million in one-time funds to buy down the property tax rate. We're going to have to face that next year. We're already looking at what this bill might do and foregone revenue. So we want the opportunity to at least come back to it in 5 years. It could work. Last, and I think this is maybe 10A, maybe not. So those are the major points I think there are of disagreement or confusion that are out there. There are several others. We didn't get into the finite details. We do have things posted on our site on the Ways and Means web committee page that is detailed as to what that annual approval of $40 million of tax increment projects amounts to over a 20-year span. So that, I think, Madam Speaker, I think this is the 10 minutes, hopefully within that. And happy to answer questions as long as they don't involve math.
All right, with that, let's take questions. Member from Georgia.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Member, thank you for the helpful outline just presented. I'm hearing that small towns in Vermont will not be able to make use of this program. Can you please speak to that? Small communities.
Sure. We have to first recognize the complexity of tax increment financing because it is very complex. So towns that do have I'm going to back up for a second. One of the most beneficial parts of tax increment financing is that the community is forced to come together and come up with a plan. So that is one of the most beneficial parts, so that tax increment financing, or CHIP in this sense, is just a part of the financial stack that is meant to really help that community realize what their vision is. So that's the best part. If your town is not organized and doesn't know what its vision is, it's going to have a really hard time administering TIF. If you are focused and you know where you want housing, you know where that is, then yes, this could be a good tool for you. Remember, we just talked about 248 different designated centers that would qualify in order to have TIF. But let's make no mistake, it's complex. If you have the ability or can bring in a consultant to help manage that project, great. That's why we realized that there's a need in the future to provide some kind of assistance to municipalities. And that might be the most beneficial thing that we can do here. Just to digress a little bit, we don't always know what a site development cost is or what the infrastructure is going to cost because it varies from place to place. If you have a brownfield that needs to be remediated in terms of putting in a housing project, that could be $1 million before you even open up the checkbook. So every project is going to have a different cost. So there's a cost estimate of $45,000 per lot or per unit in infrastructure cost. It could be much higher. It could be much lower. So there are some things that are unknowable, but if your community is organized, then you could be eligible for CHIP. And what we did in rulemaking is we really wanted to make sure there was regional equity and also that the housing needs are being met, and we wanted VEPSI to come up with rules in order to administer that.
All right. Member from Colchester.
Yes, thank you. I just have to say, as a citizen legislator, I feel very unequipped to make an informed decision on how to vote on this bill. I've currently heard from the Lake Champlain Chamber that they're opposed to it, the Greater Burlington Industrial Corporation, they're opposed to it. I'm waiting to hear back from my town planner, the Vermont Chamber of Commerce, the League of Cities and Towns, the Chittenden County Regional Planning Commission, and the Vermont Planners Association. So those are the people that I feel will inform my vote. Because if they're all opposed to it or concerned about it, I don't believe in good faith I could support this bill.
Well, let me address that for a minute. There have been proposals to come up with project-based financing, project-based TIFs, mini TIFs or other things for, well, as long as I've been in the legislature or had been in the legislature before, almost every year, as something that's simpler and easy to administer with a specific proposal, a specific project in mind. There are things that aren't going to work extremely well for everybody. I'm not sure why they're objecting to it. I have a sense of some of those things, try to address those here. Some of it is the cap. Well, our need exceeds it. We don't really know that yet. For instance, we have a Vermont Economic Growth Incentive Program that's administered by the Vermont Economic Progress Council. It has an annual cap of $10 million in credits that can be given. And that's for creating new jobs that otherwise wouldn't have been created. Oh, I forgot the but for. And the annual expense of that program is about $2 million. So we could be creating a program. We don't know what the uptake rate is going to be yet. So I understand there's some concerns about different facets of the bill. That's natural. But we think this is a very good proposal and also protecting the ed fund on the other end.
Member from Franklin.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Member, I'm just curious about you mentioned 40,000 units we need in a certain duration of time. From the testimony you received, do you have a good idea of the distribution of the need across the state? Is it clustered in certain places? Has that been able to inform anything in this bill?
Thank you for that. That is not our purview necessarily, but I did refer to a report that came out of the Department of Housing and Community Development, and that they have a regional housing needs assessment, which is a very good report. And Vermont Housing Finance Agency also did the same report in 2024 with an update this year.
Similar numbers, so it seems like it's accurate, because that's a lot. 40,000. If it's 3 people per household, it's 120,000 people. And what do we got? 650 in the state. Where are they coming from? Are they already here, or we anticipate this need?
We have to remember that the need for housing isn't just for new arrivals. We have a significant amount of dilapidated or old housing that needs to be replaced, and a number of folks that are currently unhoused. So there's a need that has been determined by them to be that large. Again, I'm not the expert on that, but yeah.
Thank you, Member.
Thank you. Member from Chittenden.
Charlie, if a community does not have zoning, can they qualify for this CHIP?
Thank you, Member. I think in the designated areas, it is in this bill as to where you could locate without the requirement that it has to have zoning. In the communities in which they are exempt from Act 250, and there are currently Act 250 exemptions that expire, those communities do have to have permanent zoning and permanent bylaws, and also either wastewater and water, or they have to have suitable soils for wastewater treatment. So those are one category of areas in this, is those communities that are currently exempt because of those things that were passed in Act 181. If we talk about existing settlements, then they're going to have to get their permits in order to have a development that needs those permits.
Member from St. Albans Town.
Thank you. I'm asking for a clarification on the ed fund here. My understanding is that if a community has a TIF and there's money that they use that would normally go to the ed fund to pay down the bond, that money that would be taken from the ed fund is made up by other communities. The ed fund has its needs, and so it has to get that payment in total, regardless of whether communities have TIFs. Is this going to work the same way, and how is that going to, for want of a better word, deprive the ed fund of the money that this will give? Am I correct in understanding that money is for the TIFs is not really depriving the ed fund of money? The money gets made up by others.
Thank you, Member. It's actually a great segue and talk about but for. So the notion is, if you believe the TIF works, you believe that the money that is being spent and being repaid from retaining part of that education tax fund, education property tax fund, is spurring that growth that would not have occurred if you hadn't done that. So it is a belief that the but-for works. So if you believe that that development is occurring because of that, then there is no impact on the ed fund, because that is a new development that's kicking off new revenue. There are those that would say that's not true, because that development would have occurred anyway, but somewhere else. But I think what we found over time is tax increment financing has also helped us in where we want to have those developments. So in St. Albans City, for instance, that is a development that we wanted to have happen in downtown St. Albans. It could have happened somewhere else. It could have happened out by the Collins Burley Sports Center, but it didn't. That development happened where we wanted it to happen. Did it increase the amount of revenue for the education fund? If you read the tax increment financing report, which is produced every year by Vermont Economic Progress Council, it has incredibly compelling numbers as to the increase in the grand list because of TIF and increased in revenues coming from the education fund. The concern is, and expressed by both the Joint Fiscal Office, the state auditor, the state economist, is that those developments and that revenue would have occurred anyway. So it is a philosophical debate. We, in this program, are saying, yes, let's actually move forward with increment financing for housing, but limit the potential exposure to the education fund.
Member from Brattleboro.
I was wondering if you could clarify briefly, rather than expansively, on Representative, I believe it was Harrison's question. My understanding is that the question of whether or not you can build somewhere with zoning is sort of a question for builders and zoners, but that the financing available in CHIP is available regardless of whether or not you have zoning. Is that correct?
That's a great point, yes. So there are those two different issues. Is the development exempt from Act 250? Or can you use CHIP in one of those designated areas where there might be a requirement for zoning or no zoning, so how do you get the permit? So it's still, there's a permitting issue, and there's also then a financing issue, and the two are separate. Thank you, member, for pointing that out.
Member from Dover.
Yeah, thanks for putting this together. Charlie, I've noticed that folks are using a lot of different language when we talk about the potential impacts to the education fund. Can you speak precisely? Because I can, but I want to give the Ways and Means Committee the opportunity to do so, about when and how the education fund is impacted by TIF and potentially by CHIP.
Thank you, member. It really comes down to, again, that belief in whether or not the development would have occurred anyway. In answer to your point, if you believe that that housing development would have occurred without using public dollars, then you are foregoing revenue that would have been paid into the ed fund anyway. So in that sense, you're relying on, you're taking money away from going into the ed fund and then asking other property taxpayers to make up the difference.
So what we're talking about here is the grand list as it exists today.
Yes.
And the amount of revenue that we're able to generate from the grand list as it exists today. We're talking about then approving a TIF or CHIP, which would then improve the grand list as it exists today, which would improve the amount of revenue that we are able to generate from that, both for the state education fund and for the municipal coffers. And we are not talking about taking all of that improvement for TIF or for CHIP, but in fact, we're talking about growing the education fund. And what concerns me is the language around taking money out of the education fund, which is not okay with me at all. But when I asked about being precise around language, it is, I think, very important for us to be very precise about when and how money is moving into or out of, is projected to grow into the education fund. And the guardrails, I appreciate that we're doing our job of making sure that programs have guardrails, that we have good accountability and oversight. That's our job. But the fact of the matter is that here in Vermont, we have put incredible guardrails on land use policy and on development and financing already. And the other fact of the matter is we have a housing crisis. So adding additional complexity, at least for rural Vermont, does not seem to be conducive to fixing that. Thank you.
I appreciate your point. Just we'll take a step backwards about what is tax increment financing so that everybody knows. I think we've been talking about it enough, and we've got some explainers on our page that are really good, and we'll support some stuff sending it out later. Essentially, with a development, there is the original taxable value, the OTV. And this is what the current properties, when you enter into a tax increment program, that is the value of the properties as they are now. Once you put in infrastructure and development is built on that, that development or that project has a much higher property value, right? So you've got the original taxable value here and the incremental value here. So what happens is those properties are not exempt from paying property taxes. That's not true. They are paying property taxes to the municipality, but the municipality is retaining a percentage of the increment of those new taxes that are being generated and paid, and using them to repay the infrastructure, the loan that was taken out to build the infrastructure. So it's kind of like a self-fulfilling cycle. A portion of that money is being paid into the education fund and to the municipality. In this bill, you'll see percentages that are 60 and 80% of retention. That's what's retained from that property tax to repay the loan to pay for the infrastructure. And a portion that's paid to the municipality. That's for 85% also for the same thing, to the municipality's property tax. So that's how tax increment financing works. In some cases, a municipality doesn't have a tax increment financing program that's generating enough, or it's close to not enough, to pay for the bond. And that's what we want to make sure with that but-for test, is that we want to make sure that the tax increment financing plan actually works. It's going to hold water, and it's going to be able to repay that bond, no matter where it is. It could be in, it could be in Richford, it could be in Plymouth, it could be anywhere. So you just have to make the numbers work. So that's really how tax increment financing works.
Member from Coventry.
Representative Kimball, could you go into a little bit of explanation on the areas that are in the CHIP proposal that actually makes it easier for small municipalities to access CHIP? Outside, because it's not just them bonding.
Yes. If I understand your question, there's two different answers. One is it's easier than TIF. TIF requires a lot more bureaucracy, and TIF, in most every case, the municipality is the developer of the infrastructure. And there's public-wide votes that have to occur every time there's an incurrence of debt, every time there's a bond issuance. The taxpayers have to come to the voting booths in order to approve it. CHIP is different. CHIP, the developer, could be the one who takes out the loan to actually make the improvements for the infrastructure, but still eligible for tax increment to repay for that financing. The similarity is there still has to be an infrastructure housing agreement between the municipality and the developer. Any CHIP project with this has to have a public hearing, not necessarily a vote, a public hearing on what that tax infrastructure program looks like, that housing infrastructure program. And parties to that are going to be the municipality, it's going to be the developer, and it could be a third fiscal sponsor if that's somebody else. So there's a few different people that are involved in that. It's still not simple, but it's simpler than is TIF. Did that answer your question, member? Okay, thank you.
Member from Derby.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Thank you, the member from Woodstock, for explaining this, because I have received emails over concern of the loss of the TIF program. And a town you keep, or small city you keep skipping over is Newport. The member from Newport up here, and we can attest to the over 1 acre hole we have in the middle of our downtown that we so want to revitalize and take care of in a few empty buildings that could be changed and repurposed to housing that we so desperately need. And also to Lindenville, where they're building the factory for 200 more jobs, high-paying jobs in the state of Vermont, and they need housing. So thank you to this body for looking into this, and thank you for bringing this message, and we will relay it to home. I have been reaching out to the town of Derby, asking them to get in line and get their plans cemented so they can go forward with all this. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, member.
Member from Bennington, and then West Windsor.
Okay. Could the member, maybe I misunderstood this, but when you were talking about point 7, you said where, and you had mentioned village centers, designated downtowns. Did I hear you say that there's 248 places that have already been designated or potentially open to be designated?
Yes, thank you, member. There are 248 designated centers in Vermont now. The Department of Community Development has been aggressive in adding village centers. So you can see a lot of village centers. Now, not all of them have the necessary infrastructure to qualify as a Tier 1A or maybe even a Tier 1B when those application processes are in, because they don't all have water, sewer, zoning, subdivision, all those requirements that it would exempt them from Act 250. But yes, those already exist.
All right, member from West Windsor.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Representative Kimball, I don't know whether you can answer this, but I brought it up yesterday and I've gotten stuck on it. I am a neurodivergent person who gets stuck on words. And in this case, it's the word blight.
Yes.
It's on page 62, and it is in section 1910F rulemaking. And I wondered, I've looked into, the word blight is rife with a terrible history of eminent domain. And it also is open to interpretation of on so many levels, urban versus rural. Within the state of Vermont, it would be open to interpretation by every single municipality. And I wondered why you chose to use that word. And I looked through other states, words that other states use. In Minnesota, in their TIF law, instead of using blight, they have purposefully replaced it with vacant or underserved buildings converted to residential units. And there was a Supreme Court case in 2005, Kelo versus the City of New London, which took issue with using the word, or an interpretation of the word blight, which wound up causing, causing private buildings to be, or privately held buildings to be taken over by municipalities, then transformed into housing, and then sold back as private properties. And so I wondered whether you would consider either removing or changing that word. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that input, member. And I know that our committee can discuss it. They know the term is squishy. It is a very commonly used term in economic development, especially TIF programs. But I appreciate the concern about the term. But Burlington did have a reurbanization in the, 1940s, 50s? Anybody remember? Anyone? No? None of us are alive, maybe. But they also had a huge program that did do just that, raised different neighborhoods and built new ones. Not to the same degree. But that reminded me something. It also allows for renovation or restoration of different projects, all right? So if you're talking about, do we want to renovate an existing building that's currently used as a school? It's permissible under this. That's where the 65% of the floor area is to be used for housing. That was 70% when it came to us. We lowered it to 65%. And we're asking VEPSI to help in defining how to calculate that 65%. We don't have the bandwidth as a part-time legislature to figure that out. We're hoping to get VEPSI's help in doing that. So if you have a gym, it's not used for housing, but it's part of an old school. Does it count towards the 65% or does it not? We really want to help and get some rules so people can know that better.
All right, we're going to take 2 more questions, the member from Starksboro, and then we'll go to the member from Pownell.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I guess I'm wondering whether the Ways and Means report is really sufficient to meet the housing crisis that's facing our state, whether it's up to the challenge that I think we need to meet, and also whether the report, in my mind, clearly excludes, large areas of the state from being able to benefit the program, and I'm questioning whether that's fair.
I'm not sure I understand the point you're making, member. Could you restate the first part about it? The report, is it the bill or the report?
I've read draft 3.1, which I believe was reported or voted on by the Ways and Means Committee. And my question is, we have an incredible housing crisis. It's affecting our economy. It's affecting our communities and our state. And I'm just questioning, whether you think that's this program with its limitations are sufficient to meet that challenge. And then the second question is, is it fair to exclude large areas of the state from the benefits of the program?
Okay, thank you. No, CHIP alone is not going to be the be-all and save-all of our housing shortage. It is a very important, powerful tool in the toolbox that'll work in a lot of cases, not in every case, but there have to be other sources of funding and financing in order to address that shortage. Remember, we're talking about estimates 2,000 to 7,000, 7,500 actually from Champlain Housing Trust, units that could be developed every year using this particular finance tool. Remember that peak was 4,800 units back in 1988. We haven't hit that kind of thing since. So it is going to meaningfully contribute to the funding available to address the housing shortage. But to think that it is the one silver bullet is to be under some illusion. It is not. It is a very important tool. The second thing is, remember, there's 248 designated centers that do qualify all over the state. It's not just in urban areas. I know in my town, we've got 3 different areas that would qualify. 4, 5. So it's huge as to where this could go.
All right, Representative, go ahead. You get the last question.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker, and I'd like to thank the member from Woodstock for standing in for all these questions. I'd like to just confirm something, and my hope is that I've sort of got this tricky stuff a little bit figured out. Middle-income housing is defined as housing that is subject to a housing subsidy covenant defined elsewhere in statute of perpetual duration. Do I understand correctly, however, that the range of what would middle income be is subsequently to be determined at a sort of regional level, project by project by VEPSI?
Yeah, thank you, member. So middle income is generally regarded, especially Vermont Housing Finance Agency, at 150% of area median income. So that's going to vary by county. So whenever you talk about affordability, it's either 80%, 120%, 150% of area median income. So it would be dependent on the location. Yep.
All right, members, that concludes the caucus of the whole. If you have any other questions, please don't hesitate